It's about 5 minutes after, so I think we should go ahead and get started. I just would like everybody to go around, and I'll kind of call out the roles that I see on the screen, and everybody can just say hi, and then if I've missed someone, we'll let those people just sort of introduce themselves. I'm Chris Bollinger. Mike Childress is here with me. So Anna, if you would just chime in and say hi that you're on.
I know she's on at least the computer. She may not be on the voice part yet, but she's definitely with us.
Okay, Kathy Slem, are you on? She may be on. Okay, great. I see those. Kathy and Anna have chimed in with the chat. That's great. Christine.
Hi, good afternoon.
Great. Good to hear you, Christine. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Dominique, are you here? Dominique, are you on chat? Can you send us a quick hi, I'm here?
I see that Dominique is on the computer, so he might not have audio, but we can always read anything from the chat window.
Okay. Erica?
Hi, I'm here. Good afternoon.
Great. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. Erin Sutton, are you online or only on computer?
I'm here.
Great. Thanks, Erin. Glenn, we know you're here. Say hi.
Hi, everybody.
And Jackie Scott.
Hello, I'm here.
And Robert Burns. Robert, I assume you're on just the computer then. Thank you all for coming. Those of you who are not on the phone line but on the computer, I'm trying to watch the chat, so if you have anything, type it in, and that way we can make sure that you are following us. Robert, thanks for joining us. So, Brian, if you would advance to slide 1, please. Great. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about 2 things. These are things that came up in our meeting last month that we wanted to look at. We have some things to report back to you. The first thing is we're going to look at the scaling measures. If you recall, what had been done prior to this in scaling our measures was we had taken the actual value and divided it by the maximum value after having trimmed it at 2 standard deviations above the mean. The new approach is to take the actual minus the smallest divided by the range, the max minus the min. And so we're going to look at how that's affected different components and their influence on the index itself. The second thing is to begin a discussion of the weighting approach. The old weighting was equal weighting of items within subdomains, and as we noted, this gives rise to some very big differences in implicit weighting in the overall index. We're going to talk about how maybe we want to implement a Delphi ratings type approach to get the weighting. So Brian, if you could advance the slide. Welcome to the couple people who just came in. We're working through. If you have anything, either type it in the thing or please feel free to speak up. And also welcome James Rahota. Thanks for coming. And Eric Carbone is here as well, I believe. Thank you. So this slide shows, this is the slide from the last meeting, and this shows the differences in the impact. And so you can see that some have a very, very low % impact on the final score. That is moving them from, yes? moving them from their lowest to their highest values had the scale on the bottom, the impact on the final score. And so some had very high impact, some had very low. There was concern that this was perhaps muting certain important factors. Brian, can you move up to the new slide? So we didn't want the measures scaling to have that differential impact. In particular, this was a problem for the dichotomous variables, as moving them from their minimum to their maximum necessarily moved them from 0 to 10 in the scale. The continuous ones were somewhat less important, and we wanted to ensure that that wasn't true. And so we didn't want that to be a part of the weighting that was sort of hidden. So Brian, if you can advance to the next slide. So this graph shows some changes that we've played around with. The red is the current structure, and that should look like the previous graph that I showed. The blue is the new scaling along with equal weights. So here what we were doing is taking each component and scaling it to using the new approach, which is the actual minus the minimum over the range. But also in this, we were equally weighting, so that what we were looking at was what if everything had a 1 over n weight in it. And so you can see for the most part it very much flattens out the impact of all of the different components, with a few exceptions, and I believe those exceptions are ones with very little range. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, well, yeah, there would be like no range. There would be, there were 11 measures where we've got a 1 for every state, right? So by definition, they were not a variable. And so mathematically, what that implied, or what that resulted in, was 0. So it was a 0 difference.
And so you can see those as little holes in the blue scheme. Brian, if you could advance to the next slide, please. So in this slide, we're comparing the new scaling with the equal weight, the blue, which we looked at before, to the original scaling with the equal weight, the red. And so here we're isolating only the impact of changing the weight, changing the scaling, holding the weights constant. And so you can see that in many cases, it took the ones with very low impact and moved them up to be equal to all the others. Brian, if you can move to the next slide, please. So this is comparing the new scaling to the old scaling, but using the original weighting scheme so that we again can compare that. And what you can see is that for the most part, it moved up some of those very lowest weighted ones at the very top of the graph and gave them more weight, but it tracks the graph very closely through most of the distribution. So it did increase the weight of some of the lowest weighted ones, and it increased the weight of some of the highest weight, or the importance of some of the highest weighted ones. There are a few that, in particular, you'll notice that there are sort of 6 singular blue lines that get above the 2.5% that come, in particular, some of them from ones that had very, very low impact before. Those tended to be continuous variables that had a very narrow range. For example, one of them, the M24, was, whoops, thank you. One of them, the M24, was percent vaccinated, a list of different types of vaccines, percent of children vaccinated. And that had a very low range, ranging only from a low of about 82% in a state up to a high of not quite 97, 98%. And so when we expand that scale to take into account from 0 to 10, that ends up having a fair amount of importance, whereas before, because it was a very narrow scale, it had much less importance. So to be honest with you, in my looking at this, I think we may need to want to think about refining this just a little bit more on the scaling, but we can talk about that as we go forward. And I think, Brian, if you go one more slide, please. Great. So that's where we were on the scaling, and if you want to look at a particular slide, you can ask Brian to move it forward. And I'd like to open it up to just, whoops, no. Can you leave it on the previous one, Brian? Thank you. I'd like to open it up. Anyone who has any questions or comments about this, I'd like to hear your thoughts, please.
This is Glenn, just what people are thinking and formulating. I think clearly this new scaling method solves one of the big problems that we've identified from previous versions of the index, and that is that the difference in influence of dichotomous variables versus continuous variables, and there will be the outside influence, the unduly large influence of some of the dichotomous measures. We've now, through this new scaling method, really equalized the influence of those two different types of measures, and so that's definitely, I think, progress. I think a real benefit of moving to this new scaling method.
Bob Burhans. So my question is I'm looking at this slide, and it says new scaling does not exercise a differential impact on index scores. So if we were to take a look at the current domains and subdomains, what you're saying is by doing this scaling, there would be no change in the scores across the subdomains?
Now, I think, Bob, okay, so let me think about this. This is, what we're saying is that all other things equal, that the scaling does not in itself exercise, it doesn't, the scaling itself does not introduce a differential change. That is to say, the scaling treats all measures equally. But the way that the current model structure is constructed, you're still going to see changes or differences between measures, but it's not going to be because of the scaling. The differences that we see will be because of the weighting that is implicit in the model, in the current model structure.
So have you, with doing this scaling, have you recalculated the individual scores? Or you haven't done that?
Hi, Bob. Bob, this is Mike again. Yes, actually, I took the current Excel sheet that is the original Excel sheet, and I worked within it to change the scores. So to answer your question, yes, I can't tell you a lot about how the scores change. I didn't really look at individual states or domains or subdomains within states. I was focused on the overall averages for a particular measure, as well as the minimum and the maximum, in order to calculate, in order to perform the sensitivity analysis to create the scores.
David, I think I'll have Brian send out a copy of the slides for you to everyone. And David asked in the chat if we can get a copy of the slides. I'm not sure when that will occur. It may not be till after we hang up. Brian's currently on the other end advancing slides and stuff for us. So we will try to get that to you again soon. And I just got your email. Actually, I may be able to do this. Anyone else have any questions at this point?
Just to comment on Bob's question, this is Glenn. I think certainly the rescaling will definitely have an impact on the overall scores and the domain and subdomain scores. So we should probably take a look at that. It certainly would, it has the potential to, if one were to rank states on these scores, that's not something that has been emphasized historically with the index. But if one were to rank states based on either the overall index score or based on domain or subdomain scores, this rescaling certainly could have an impact, could change some of the relative positioning of states based on those scores, because it is changing the influence of measures that the measures have on those overall scores. So, and we can certainly take a closer look at that, at those kind of implications. But I think it does solve a big problem with the original version of the index methodology, just in terms of the outsized influence of dichotomous measures and this, not kind of fully not fully capitalizing on the full range of results in the individual items.
Glenn, this is Kathy. For the measures that are all 1 across the index or all 0, what does that do to the contribution of those measures to the index? Yeah, well, in these sensitivity analyses, those measures drop out. They don't drop out. They become 0 because the numerator, in the denominator, the min versus the max, undefined. So those measures drop out. And implicitly, measured with no variation, they exert no influence on the overall index scores. Regardless, if there's no variation, they're not going to play a role there. I think we are on a parallel track, taking a close look at those individual items that show no variation, and having our model design work group take a look at those to make some decisions about the value of keeping those in versus dropping them out. I think a number of them, I know they were considered to be kind of placeholders for things we'd like to measure but can't currently. A number of them, I think, conceptually are pretty problematic as well, as in addition to being of no value kind of from a measurement standpoint, as we're seeing here. So I think we are going to want to take a look at what to do with those measures and really the value add of keeping them on.
It strikes me that we need to think about exactly, what are we, because you can fix one problem and create another one too, and that's, I think we have to just wrestle through what the trade-offs are. Because if we're simply trying to maximize discriminatory power using the index, that's one approach. If we're trying to say these are the items that are critical for health security to be in place, and to highlight some of those, even if everybody has those, and track progress towards that, that may be a different thing to consider.
Absolutely.
So I want to make sure we really think through how we want to utilize the index and communicate the index and what messages that gives communication-wise as we trade those off.
Brian, would you do me a favor and can you go back, I think it's like to slide 4, please? A little further. No, I'm sorry, that was too far. 5, 6, 7. Yeah, maybe it's 7 that I want. I apologize, Brian. Perfect, that one right there. Thank you. I'm kind of trying to respond to your comment here. I think you're exactly right. We have to be careful as to what this is doing. When we look at this, and we can look too back at the ones where we did the equal scaling. When I look at this graph in particular, the one that's up now, one of the things that I note is that the really important, the real importance of the weighting, because this is where all we're doing is keeping the weighting the way it is in the current index and changing the scaling. And so the changing of the scaling brings some of those at the very top of the graph that we're having very, very little impact, sort of up to having a little bit of an impact. But clearly the dominant aspect here is the weight. And so in a sense, your question about do we want it to show something that's really important, I think, you know, this is the problem is with mathematically, right, and I'm sure you know this, I don't want to be accused of over-explaining things, but, right, mathematically, it's really hard to separate weighting from scaling because it's just a linear model, right? I mean, you know that. I'm talking to hear myself talk. So I think in a way, sort of picking one and making the scaling straightforward sort of takes the leverage of the scaling out, and then we can focus on the weighting and use the policy in the weighting. Does that make sense as a way to proceed, or do you think there's something more important in the scaling too? I guess is where I'm going.
No, I think I have to look at it more closely and think about it because there's a lot happening at once as we look at it. But I guess the other question that comes to mind as I think about it is how does this handle? And there may be a perfectly good answer. I just haven't thought through it yet. How does it handle when you have a target that may not necessarily, I hope over time we learn what the right amount is of certain things. Are we making, and we've always made assumptions, I think, that more is better sometimes, but will that be able to be factored in as we look at some of these things, or are we, maybe, you know, if there's a standardized target, how does that fit into some of this model or the scaling that we're doing? Is it captured still?
Yeah, Kathy, that's a good point. I mean, one can make a diminishing returns argument on some of these, of course, right? In which case you might want the scaling to reflect that. But I think you get very with 170 measures, we could spend a lot of time thinking about that, and I'm not sure how productive it would be at this point.
Sure, no, it's a hard thing to solve. I'm not trying to fix it right now. I'm just trying to think about making sure we have a structure that's going to hold up so we can, as we hopefully improve things over time, which this may well do. It's certainly improving a lot of things.
No, I think you're right, and I think you're echoing one of the concerns that I probably didn't articulate very well that I have. One of the ones on there, I think it was M24 that I looked at this morning with Mike. Is this vaccination rate, right? And that's a case where, like, you know, if everybody was at 97% and above, I might not care. And the way we're scaling it is the difference between 97 and 100 would have the same impact as if we have the much wider range that we have now, which is like 82% to about 95 or 96%. And so there is a sense in which as we move forward, I'm not sure that letting the scaling adjust every year is smart. But I think for now it's a good beginning.
Yeah, I think it would probably help me to some point take a couple of actual measures and walk through what it looks like. I'm still struggling to get I'm not the mathematician here, struggling to get my mind around how all of it works. But it's really interesting, and I'm glad you're looking at it carefully.
So perhaps what we could do is send around the spreadsheet with the measures. I'm not sure how constructive that would be because it's a mess. Not because it's badly put together, by the way. It's very brilliantly put together, but Mike's done a great job, but because, and others before him, but because it is a lot of measures. But I'll have Mike look into how we might do that going forward.
So this is Bob Burhans. One of the things that would be helpful is when we look at this chart right now, sensitivity analysis, percent impact on final index score, and we look at the current lines, you know, the red and the blue. It basically is, you know, also building in the bias that we know we have by the intrinsic weighting that's in it right now by subdomain. Is there any way to see this sensitivity analysis taking away that bias? So then we would be able to focus.
Brian, could you go to slide 6, please? I believe it's the one just before this one. Perfect. Thank you. So Bob, here we've taken out the weighting and we've done an equal weights analysis. That wasn't me. So what we've done is we've made all the weights equal and then compared the new scaling to the old scaling. And so you can see with the old scaling, the places where the red line is very short, those were the ones where there wasn't very much variation, and the blue line, for the most part, with the exception of a couple where there's no variation, has sort of lined everything up now. And so that's a case where we're kind of isolating, really, we're netting out the effects of the weighting strategy that we have and isolating only the effects of the scaling. Does that help, Bob? Can you all hear me?
Yeah, no, 100%. That's right on target, Chris. And I might say, just going back to Kathy's overall comment about a target, certainly I think, you know, for items where we do have good solid evidence-based targets or where we have national goals, we can definitely, you know, I think we would certainly want to use those targets as the maximum value. I mean, I think that the example about immunization rates is a good one. I think we do have a national consensus target. You know, we got a Healthy People 2020 target of, you know, what we'd like to hit as a nation in terms of vaccination rates, and that's partly based on the science of communicable disease epidemiology. So those kind of measures are very few and far between in this index. Measures where we already have a consensus national goal of what we're trying to hit. But where we do have items like that, I think, you know, obviously, you know, we can use that target as the maximum value to address, you know, some of those issues.
Mm-hmm.
This is Bob Burhans. I'm sorry, my phone battery died, so I had to jump on another phone, so I apologize.
Did my explanation help?
Yes, it did.
Okay. Do you have more questions? Comments?
No, not right now.
Okay.
I think the other one just that we talked about, and just so we don't talk about the table entirely, is just making sure we think forward about ones that are the same everywhere but are critical to health security, and how we make sure that we still, or assuming we want to, make sure that we are still use the index to highlight the important areas that we may all have achieved, but they are critical and a component of our structure and our systems.
Hold that thought. I think that's a good one. Any other questions or comments on the scaling? Okay, Brian, if you could advance to the Delphi weighting, the first Delphi weighting slide, please. Perfect, right there. So the second part of this puzzle, and this really, I think, Cassie has raised questions that are important to this, is how we do this weighting. And the weights we have were arrived at, as we discussed in the last meeting, in a variety of ways. But there's some concern about whether they're really the appropriate weights. And they were arrived at, as I recall. Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but so essentially we took the subdomains, and things are equally weighted within their subdomains, and then the subdomains are weighted up to the domains equally, and then the domains are weighted up to the final index equally. So what that means is that, in a sense, an item in a subdomain with a lot of other items gets very little weight, whereas an item in a subdomain with very few items ends up with a lot of weight in the final index. That may or may not be the best weighting scheme. And so one of the things that was suggested at the last meeting was to use a Delphi approach to arrive at the weights, but there's huge questions here. And I think that, in all honesty, I'll tell you, foreshadowing, this is the last slide, because what's important here is sort of getting some beginning on these experts. And so the big questions are, what gets weighted? Do we ask the experts to weight all the measures? Do we ask the experts to rate the subdomains and the domains? The second one is weighted with respect to what? Are they state-specific risks, or all hazards, uniform planning scenarios? How do we give instruction to a Delphi group? And then perhaps most importantly, and most difficultly, who are the experts? I don't expect that we'll answer all of this today, but what I'd like to throw out to begin with is this question of what do we ask the experts to weight? Measures, subdomains, domains, and how might we go about phrasing that to the experts?
This is James from Rhode Island, and I have a question and maybe a clarifying need for this part of the discussion. And so when we talk about what gets weighted, have we looked at what measures, especially given the changes that you've seen with both the scaling and sensitivity analysis that you've done, if we were to create more composite measures within the subdomains and then look at those two analyses first again? And the reason I say that is we didn't use them very much to begin with, except towards the end. I think is when we really created a few. And on one hand, I'm curious to see, are those holding up differently than the ones that are not any sort of composite? And would it be helpful to then get the panel's reaction to, is this a good composite measure that measures, and if so, what construct is it measuring, and then what's the weight?
Hi, James. This is Mike. So if I recall, there are 3 composite measures. There are 2 composite measures that are really, an index or an average of 2 measures each. That is to say that there are four measures that roll up to 2 separate measures. And then there's another measure that I think is a workforce kind of measure, some data that you guys got from BLS maybe, where there might be close to a dozen workforce kinds of measures that roll up into, a composite. I guess my gut reaction to what you said is that one would have to explore that very carefully, right? Because, we, at the meeting last month, we presented some of the analyses that Dominique did, where he looked at how well some of the measures were hanging together within a particular sub-index, and then the subdomains and subdomains into domains and so forth. And so, I personally would not want to just begin grabbing measures and deciding that, well, these 5 measures look like the same thing to me, right? So, and I'm just going to create a composite measure out of these. It would have to be done either through it would have to be done through simultaneously, I think, through some kind of statistical analysis similar to what we did previously to identify those items that hang together. And then it would have to be looked at by, subject matter experts to see if these things make sense from a substantive perspective before we could then create indices and then redo a sensitivity analysis. So I guess, in my mind, we would be looking at several months worth of work to create the indices before we could redo a sensitivity analysis along the lines of what we did here. Anyhow, that's just my kind of knee-jerk or gut reaction to your comment.
No, absolutely. I understand that, and I think it would be time-consuming. But I guess the question that I have is it worth looking at that first before we go into the second process? And so I would just throw that out to the group.
And this is Glenn, just to weigh in on that. I think again, if you think back to the multi-item scale analysis we presented at our meeting last month, that analysis, looking at the item scale correlations at both subdomain and domain levels, really provide us with that kind of analysis. We're basically using the existing structure of subdomains and domains, treating those as composite measures because that's what they are, and seeing how well they hang together. And if you remember from that, we identified a number of those. In a number of cases, the items hung together well with their appropriate subdomain and domain. In those cases, we don't want to mess with a good fit. But there are also another set of items that did not correlate well with their composite, with their subdomain and domain grouping. And those are the ones where we're taking a closer look at now about alternative ways of grouping those items to try to get a better fit, to get stronger, more valid composites. If you're again thinking about the subdomains and domains as composite measures. I personally don't think there's a lot of value in looking within subdomains to find yet smaller groupings that we can consider composites. I think we run into small numbers and small degrees of freedom problems, and in that regard. But I think the spirit behind your comment, I think, is largely what's driven the work we presented last month around looking at how well the current methods for grouping items into composites, grouping them into subdomain and domain groupings, how well they work. And we're using that now with our model design group to test some alternative ways of grouping to deal with those issues. But those issues really are quite independent of the scaling and weighting issues.
So this is Bob Burhans. I mean, when I look at the 190 measures or whatever the number is these days, there's within each subdomain there are a few measures that are, very, very strong measures. They're not just, capacity measures like the number of doctors per 100,000 population, but they're strong measures, and although they may not be outcome, they're I refer to them as intermediate outcome measures, and so they're strong, and right now you're right, they get mixed in with some measures which probably have a fairly weak association with success within that subdomain. So why it's when you say what gets weighted, there almost needs to be some quality review of the measures that indicate that the measure is a strong measure and it's meaningful to determine how effective that subdomain in the state is being executed. So I hate to say it, but you almost really do need to start at the measure level and work your way up. I think that we wrestled with the issue of all hazards, state-specific risks, and uniform planning scenarios, and we basically pushed it off until this year to take a look at those issues and to decide what the best way is to go. I think that all hazards is important to rank states in all hazard way, but at the same time, I think it would be extraordinarily important to be able to take a look at specific hazards, state-specific risks, and do a measurement against those specific risks, which one of those subdomains are the most important contributors to a response and recovery for those set of risks, and be able to to compare those risk sets with an all hazards model. So that's just my thoughts. It's a lot of work, but it seems to me that when I look at the melange of measures, there are some that right now are not equal to others within the subdomains, and we also have missing subdomains, and we need to do something with that, and we also probably need to take a look at some of the other areas where we have missing capabilities that are not built into this. But just looking at what we have now, I think that you almost have to start at the measure level. I'll throw that out to start the conversation amongst the other group. It'd be very nice to hear what other folks have to say.
I just want to jump in. Christine typed into the chat box question, do we believe that the current domains substantively are well accepted and appropriate given the broad range of index consumers? And I think that sort of echoes to some degree what Bob was bringing up, but I think it's a good question as well if anyone has any thoughts on that. And Christine may, and she's welcome to keep typing and I'll keep reading for her. Anyone else?
Yeah, Chris, this is Christine. Yeah, it's sort of the where Bob was coming at, starting at the measure level. This is sort of the opposite end of it, and going, okay, at the end of the day, once everything is delivered and calculated, for the consumers, for people who are going to be using this index, is that the information that they are going to want, that they're going to use, that they need, and then sort of like, we're trying to address this from two different sides, which are both very valid, and we have to, in the middle of all this, we have to address the stuff that doesn't hang statistically well in this to make everything nice and sound and solid at the end of the day.
I agree.
Yeah, that's a great question, Christine. I would just respond that again, as we talked about last month, we do know there are a number of other domains and subdomains that have been nominated by stakeholders who were involved in this process in prior years, as well as new measures and domains that have been nominated over the last 3 months during our open call for measures. So we do have a list of items for development, and we're currently on a parallel track, looking at ways of capturing measures that would fit into some of those constructs that aren't currently represented in the index. So we're trying to do that on a parallel process. We're not going to be able to populate all of those additional recommended constructs, likely in this next version of the index, which we hope to release, in January 2016. But this will be an ongoing process. We need to continue to go back, revisit that conceptual model, think about what constructs are not currently represented in the index as a domain or a subdomain or an individual measure, and keep refining it. But again, that's work our model development work group is kind of charged first and foremost with helping us think through on those elements.
This is Kathy. You throw out a thought or an idea, kind of building on Christine's question, which I think is a good one. I'm thinking that from this standpoint, the index is really about subdomains and domains, and the measures are only a tool to get us to a reasonable assessment of where we are in that subdomain and domain. So at the end of the day, may not care that every measure is fully contributing to the index as much as are the subdomains the right collection of measures and the right weighting within the subdomain to meaningfully reflect where that subdomain is as a state or as a nation. So in some ways I'm thinking that it's sort of looking at the subdomain level with sort of the user perspective, what Christine is asking, if I understand it right, and then going back to say, okay, what's the right collection of measures and the right weighting of those measures in that subdomain to reasonably give us an answer for that subdomain of where we are. I think the danger is we don't want to necessarily go so much reductions to the 197 measure level and try to make them all even as to what they collect individually on the index, as much as look at subdomain levels and then go back and it may look different in different subdomains as to what's the right collection and structure within that subdomain to capture that issue. Does that make sense?
It does to me. It seems to me that at least a couple of us are suggesting that we may need to go and form a variety of Delphi panels at the subdomain or at least at the domain level to consider how to weight things up to represent the subdomains and the domains accurately. Does that seem like a reasonable summary of the comments?
Yeah, I think it's looking at the quality and the collection with subdomain and getting some input in terms of what do we have that one of the most the mathematical aspect of that in terms of how they combine best and its content piece of are we looking at the right things. So we don't want to go down the path of we have to capture every single detail and nuance of preparedness because we'll just have thousands of measures and it'll be a mess. But yeah, I think you're right. I think there's some expertise that go into look at the strength of subdomains in terms of both their content and their the validity of those measures.
Well, so Kathy, this is Mike Childers. So I guess that I almost thought you were going to say something contrary to what Bob was suggesting, where Bob suggested that we begin weighting, focusing the weights at the measure level. I thought you were going to say we should weight at the subdomain level. You did. Okay, so you are saying that.
Well, I'm actually saying that before you do that, you first have to look at the strength of the subdomains and their ability to reflect that subject matter area.
Right, okay.
And I do think there is the ability to once you've done that, to begin to, with some expert input more broadly, now you kind of go very outside the subdomain expertise, to look at it and say, for instance, look at it on risk. You could weight at subdomain levels based on certain risks, certain kinds of events, or infectious disease events versus earthquakes or something. But that's a different different level, or even you could do it. You could look at weighting at the subdomain and domain level for all hazards. I mean, that's potential to do. But I think there's both. But when you start to weight, you don't want to wait before you've got a sense that what you've got is validly reflecting that component. So I guess I'm kind of saying both, or thinking about both.
Yeah, Mike and Kathy, I think you're kind of clarifying my thoughts. I mean, right, what I meant by looking at the existing measures within the subdomains, it's almost like doing, we called them measure details or deep dives that we did on each measure. Well, it seems to me that we really need to do that for each one of the subdomains, and then for each one of the domains. Is the collection of measures within that subdomain, adequate to reflect the capabilities and capacities in a state to discharge or measure its performance in each subdomain, and then for each domain, do we have the right capabilities described in the subdomains to be able to say that if we roll these measures up, it's going to give us an indication that the subdomain is that the domain is being adequately measured. But that review, it's implicit in that review when you do the subdomain work that you're looking at the collection of measures that are within that subdomain and whether they're not they're adequate or inadequate to look at the subdomain. So I think that process is, those two processes are tied. I mean, if you're going to do that kind of analysis, you're going to be looking at the individual measures to see what they say and how well they come together to measure the effectiveness of a state in that subdomain. So it's kind of it's saying the same thing, but placing emphasis on a different part of the structure, I guess is the way to say it.
I think that's a good point. I'd like to draw this to a close because we said 2 to 3, and I'm trying to keep us on our timeline because some people have to leave, as one person has noted in the chat. I think, and the short answer, Christine, to your question is I think we do have a visual map, but I'm not sure where it is. We can probably try to put something together.
Yeah, we got one.
So what I think we've kind of said is that it's going to be a very complex Delphi approach where we're going to need to look at both the construct of the subdomains and how they fit into the domains, as well as how the domains then aggregate up to the main index. And so I think we can take this discussion and at least begin to outline some ideas for a Delphi approach here. We didn't really get a chance to talk about who are the experts, and maybe we'll need to do that at our next meeting. So please, if you have any thoughts on that right now, write them down so that you can remember them in a month, because I assume everyone is like me and can't remember things from day to day. If you're better at that than I am, wonderful. I want to thank you all for your attendance. Glenn, did you want to sign us off with any last thoughts?
Only just to echo your thanks. Thanks for your wisdom. I think we've made some good progress here. We still have a road ahead of us, but I'm confident that we'll be able to move forward. So thanks, everybody. Look forward to the discussion next month.
I'd especially like to thank Brian. Brian is, I think, sitting in a basement somewhere on a borrowed computer, and he's been running the slides for us. And Brian, you've done a great job. Thank you so much. Not an easy job to do. And I'd like to thank Mike Childress as well, who we just kind of throw these, hey, do this sensitivity analysis at him, and he and then Dominique as well. He and Dominique have been crunching the numbers and bringing back the answers to us. So thank you to both of them. And thanks again to all of you for taking time. I hope you have a great day. You know where to reach both Glenn and I on email. I'm Chris Bollinger. Please don't hesitate to send any thoughts you have, and we'll compile them. Have a great day, and Good luck.
Thank you.